2015, one of the things I've done in a lot of my research is travel around the world and meet with both sides in the struggle for democracy. And that includes meeting dictators and despots and also people who are fighting for democracy. And Saakevich is very much in the second camp. He was somebody who was in the Soviet military in Belarus, in Eastern Europe, which is now a country known as the last dictatorship in Europe. And he wanted to run for president. And for that crime, quote-unquote crime, there was one point where he held a rally, not allowed rally, during the presidential campaign. And thugs from the regime kidnapped him, threw a hood over his head, threw him in the back of a van, and drove off. And he had no idea whether he would see his family again, whether he would be executed summarily, or what would happen to him. And what ended up happening was he was put into prison, into solitary confinement, where he was told that he could be released if he signed a confession, saying that he was plotting to overthrow the government and was secretly a dictator in waiting, and he refused. And that simple act of courage meant that he rotted in prison for a little more than 4 years. I met Saakevich about 2 months after he was released from prison in a cafe that was roughly the size of this room, and we were the only 2 people in it to start, except for our 2 handlers from the KGB, one who was following me and one who was following Saakevich, came and sat by us. And the one who was following Saakevich took her phone out and held it like this behind her, as though she was reading her phone, but was of course filming. Saakevich turned to me and said, I picked one of the cafes without the microphones and the table, so they had to do it the old-fashioned way. But the reason I bring up this story is partly because it gives you an insight into how harrowing the battle for global democracy actually is outside the West, which is something I think people who are in Western societies fixating on the European elections and the rise of authoritarian populism in societies that are prosperous sometimes lose sight of. So that's one part. And the second thing that I think is so important about this story is that as I walked out into the night and Saakevich went one way with his KGB agent following him, and I went back to my hotel with my KGB agent following me, he turned to me and he said 7 words that I've just never forgotten, that have always haunted me, that I talk about a lot. And he said, "You don't know how lucky you are," right? And I think that's something that when we talk about global democracy is really, really true, is that when I travel around parts of sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East or Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe that are still under the yoke of dictators, they really are just fighting to have a fair shot, right? And we have problems in the West that are very, very serious. There's really rampant inequality, as we've heard about in previous panels. We've heard about economic injustice. We've heard about the environmental catastrophe that is ongoing. But sometimes you need someone to say, you know what, we have it really, really good in comparative terms. Now, I'm going to talk about both scourges that we're facing right now in the crisis of global democracy, both in the West and in the rest of the world, and why it's worth fighting for democracy. And that's the hope that I'll hopefully end on. Now, the good news is that there are more elections than ever before in human history. It's a brief bit of good news because even though we have more elections than ever before in human history, the world is becoming less democratic. So just to put this into chart terms, this is the number of national elections per year, higher than ever before, steadily rising. But those elections are of poorer and poorer quality because, as I talk about in the book, How to Rig an Election, people have figured out how to rig elections. And so a lot of elections are sham contests that are meaningless. You have a lot of elections without democracy across the world. This is translated into a very disappointing and depressing statistic, which is that for 12 years running, with no sign of letting up, the world has become more authoritarian every year than the previous year. That the number of countries who are becoming more democratic, which is the countries in blue here, are being outpaced significantly by the number of countries that are becoming more authoritarian, which is in the red. And I think, unfortunately, that trend is going to get worse before it gets better for some reasons I'll explain shortly. Now, when you think about democracy, I've tried to come up with an analogy, right? How do you put all these diverse countries with diverse histories and diverse systems of government into some sort of framework that makes sense to most people? And what I've come up with is the idea of a sandcastle. And bear with me, I promise it makes sense. So with a sandcastle, say you're on the beach, you want to build a sandcastle. You start with this little lump of sand. That is not hard, right? This is an election. An election is pretty easy to set up. It's pretty easy to have a poor quality election that's rigged, that doesn't have a free press, where the candidates are like Nikolai Statkevich thrown into the backs of vans. What's really difficult is to make a sandcastle that looks like that, right? And it takes centuries and centuries and centuries of hard work. And it takes repair, right? So when one part of it falls down or a gust of wind hits it, you have to fix it. And the problem is, whether the sandcastle looks like that or like that, it can end up being washed away, right? And it can end up being washed away either in one giant wave, in say a coup d'etat or a revolution or a dictator seizing power, or it can slowly recede beneath the waves as little waves sort of chip away at the sand, taking one grain at a time, right? And I would argue that in many parts of the world that are dictatorships, of course, the sandcastle has been washed away. In the West, I think the waves are hitting it, and they're taking grains of sand, and that we're growing used to those grains of sand being lost every day, but they're really starting to add up, and that we have a real serious threat on our hands for global democracy, both outside the West and in the West. Now, there's a perfect storm to continue this analogy that is threatening these sandcastles, and I'm going to go through a few of these reasons for it. One is that there is a significant amount of power in global politics amassed by a group of authoritarian leaders, and two of them in particular that are very powerful, Russia and China, have not only created an aggressive push for authoritarianism where they're supporting authoritarian governments, but also with China, as I'll show in a moment, they've created the seduction of a model that seems to work economically, that is inspiring or being used as a pretext to destroy democracy by leaders in, say, sub-Saharan Africa who say, we just need to follow the Chinese model, enough with the elections, while they still don't deliver the growth that China has. So this is one aspect that is combined at the same time with the rise of authoritarian populists in the West who do not support democracy in the rest of the world, right? And everybody who knows history knows that the Western support for democracy is checkered at best. Sometimes it's real, often it's not. But it was better when there was at least some pretense that we cared about this than the open embrace of people like Donald Trump saying that he's in love with Kim Jong-un, right? Which he literally said that they wrote love letters to each other and that they're in love. Now, this aspect of the global trends is made possible and accelerated and made worse by one of my favorite graphs of all time, which is this one I'll explain in a moment. I promise you'll remember this graph because it's called the elephant graph for this reason. It looks like an elephant. The elephant graph, what it's looking at is on the left is the poorest people in the world, on the right is the richest people in the world, and the y-axis going up and down is how much they've made in terms of gains, economic gains, over say, the last 30 years. The data ends 11 years ago, but the picture is broadly similar, right? And what you see is that the back of the elephant is basically China, right? So up there is basically China being lifted out of poverty, several hundred million people. One of the most impressive and important anti-poverty programs of world history, if not the most impressive. And what you see towards the trunk is that in areas that are rich but not the richest people in rich countries, you actually see either a flat line of growth, in some places a decline of wealth, and then the trunk, which is the rich in the rich countries, right? And this is partly the story of economic inequality in the last 30 years that has made people question the idea of democracy and has made people demand strong men who basically give simple but incorrect solutions that don't actually solve anything, but you believe at least we have a chance because we've been stuck at the bottom for so long. Well, the Chinese have had relative gains, even though they're significantly more poor than the Western countries. Now, this economic question, which drives the sort of desire for authoritarianism, has been made much, much worse by disinformation, the spread of lies, and the spread of xenophobia that comes with that. So you have, of course, people like Donald Trump and other authoritarian populists who attack what I would say are people who try, at least, to provide the truth, and try to denigrate them and say they're the sole arbiters of truth in the world. Then you also have that coupled with fear-mongering, right? People like Nigel Farage in the UK who have said that we're being invaded or that this is inevitably going to be the loss of your country if you do not stand up to the elites who only want to throw you down, but trust me and I'll make it better. And what it's translated into is a series of false perceptions that people vote on. One, going off the Nigel Farage poster, is if you look throughout Western countries, the perceptions of how many Muslims live in our country, which is used as a fear-mongering tactic in Western societies, versus how many actually live in the country, the results are extremely consistent and shocking, right? Look at the US on the bottom. We've got around 1% of Americans are Muslim. The most common answer of which percentage of Americans do you think are Muslim is close to 15%. Up at France, you have significantly higher numbers. The disparity is enormous. It speaks for itself, right? And so it's clear that this fear-mongering and disinformation has made a massive difference. And the problem is that it's only getting worse because of online disinformation campaigns that have been accelerated and furthered by social media, which continues to add fuel to this very, very difficult fire. And that's why I think that the 21st century challenge has had a shift in what one of the threats to democracy has become. In the 20th century, I think one of our main scourges, one of the main challenges, was dealing with the problem of uninformed voters. People who didn't know what was happening, people who didn't care about politics, people who stayed home from the polls. The uninformed voters have been replaced by misinformed voters. And misinformed voters are much more dangerous because they believe something that is not true, and they are willing to blow up the system in pursuit of that falsehood. And that is something that I think is going to be a much, much longer challenge for how, much harder challenge for how we actually fix it. Now, all of this together has meant that we have significant polarization, which makes compromise that much more difficult. And compromise is one of the lifebloods of democracy, right? Trying to find common ground. And one of the reasons why it's gotten so bad is because democracy, at the end of the day, requires a shared sense of reality, right? If we can't agree on that a problem exists, it's impossible to compromise to solve it. And unfortunately, as these falsehoods and lies and disinformation campaigns have accelerated in the world of social media, hyperpolarization, etc., it's becoming that much more difficult to inhabit a shared reality and that much more difficult, therefore, to solve problems. So now I'll conclude the last bit of dispiriting information before I try to give a positive note to end on. This is the scariest graph you've probably never seen, which is the percentage of people who say it is essential to live in a democracy based on the decade of their birth. So on the left of each country is the people born in the 1930s. These are the people who lived through World War II. They understood the challenges of authoritarianism. They understood Nazism and the Soviet system. And on the right is the people born when I was in the 1980s, right? And what you see is that no matter which country you pick, this is true everywhere, but the line is sharper in some, the number of people who say it's essential to live in a democracy has declined considerably by generation. And this means that the next generation is more and more willing to question the idea that we should have democracy, right? This idea of enlightened despotism, which I appreciate from the previous speaker, is one where somebody like Nikolai Statkevich told me that he was hopeful that when Alexander Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus, took power, that he was an enlightened despot, that he was somebody who was fighting for people like him. He supported him, right? The guy who would end up torturing and jailing him, the guy who ran for president and ended up in the back of that van, thought, this will be our savior. And that's why I'm very, very reticent to believe that enlightened despots actually exist, because every despot started off as an enlightened one. Now, with that idea, I do want to close on a hopeful note, which is that we have an immense amount of power in our societies, whether it is in the West or without, because this group of people in this room are people who have influence, they have means comparative to the rest of the world, and we have the ability to shape opinion. And the idea that democracy is a system of government that is ever adaptable, ever changing, and can always be rebuilt, like that sandcastle. I'll go back to the slide since we're going to the hopeful bit. We got to go towards this. It is always possible, right? We may be running out of time with the climate. We may have serious, serious challenges, but the way to fix them is by involving ever more people, debating ideas, and ensuring that our ideas, the ones that say we can make humanity better, more prosperous, we can share wealth, we can create solutions to solve the climate, we can adapt and solve economic injustice, we can deal with refugees in a humane way. That is the future of democracy. And so I agree with Winston Churchill in this sense, which is that his quote about democracy is absolutely right, which is it is the worst form of government except all of the other ones. And that is how I view it, right? At the end of the day, there are a lot of things that are wrong with democracy. It makes you want to pull your hair out when you look at the election results sometimes, or when you look at what's being posted on Twitter or Facebook, or when you look at Donald Trump, for God's sake. But all of those things are only solvable if we maintain and preserve and protect the system that allows us to have a choice to fix these problems and to solve them. And I hope that you will all do your parts in your own societies to build that democratic sandcastle all together. Thank you very much.